welcome to Chapter 11 on implementing budgets. In Chapter 10 we considered how to set the budget and we looked at the numbers that would go into the budget. In this chapter, however, we are going to look at areas such as motivation and approaches to implementing the budget. Where you're likely to see this chapter examined in the F2 exam is in section A of the paper. And it's much more likely to be a knowledge type question. So it's unlikely to include calculations, as we've seen in the previous chapter. The areas that we'll cover in this chapter are much more likely to be in a discursive type multiple choice or objective testing question, where you'll be expected to recall the facts. So a knowledge type question. Okay, let's look at some of the areas that we'll cover by considering the summary diagram.
So let's see what we're going to be looking at then. We're going to be thinking about styles of setting budgets and the impact that that has on people. So thinking about motivation and the likely behavioural outcomes of different approaches. And the theorist here then that we should be mentioning is called Hopwood. The second thing we'll be thinking about then is how businesses can actually use the budgeting process to try and help them reduce and control costs. So we'll be looking then at different approaches to cost reduction, so sort of different drivers then and rationale for them, and then different ways of implementing those different methods of cost control and reduction. We start off by reminding ourselves of why we're actually preparing those budgets. And remember, it's there as part of the planning and control cycle to help management with their plans and also their allocation or the control of the limited resources that the organisation has. We need to make sure then that if we've got all this wonderful information, that it's being correctly interpreted and used by the managers and employees of the organisation. And one of the things by correct use that we mean is motivation. We want to encourage what we call goal congruence. And by goal congruence, in layman's terms, what we're saying is that we want our employees to make decisions that are in the best interest of the company. Not motivated by self-interest, but actually making decisions that, yes, benefit them, but also benefit the wider company. And you can also see here that we've got the SEMA official terminology definition. So it's the state in which leads individuals or groups to take actions that are in their self-interest, but also, as I said, the best interest of the company. And it's very important, and businesses spend a lot of time trying to maintain the motivation of their managers, because if you've got your managers involved and on board, then hopefully they will get their subordinates also involved to try and achieve the targets. One of the ways then that we can enhance the motivation of our employees is to get them involved in the planning process, inputs and ideas, and make sure that they buy into the budgets, because they're much more likely to achieve them if they believe that they're possible. And it also helps then if we're going to offer them some kind of rewards to achieve that behaviour which benefits the organisation, because then it fits into the definition of being in their best interest as well as the company's best interests. And if we want people to believe in us, we need to make sure that we keep them abreast of any changes in our strategic plans and why they're crucial, if they are, to the budget preparation. So what sort of behavioural problems then might businesses face? Well, problems can arise because people who set the budget are not responsible for achieving it. So we can end up with a situation where people don't believe that it's possible or that it's a good idea because they weren't consulted. We can also end up with a situation where perhaps the reward system encourages managers to do something that's in their best interest so that they get their bonuses, Perhaps if their bonuses are based on number of clients, they might discount heavily, which has an adverse impact on the company's profitability. There might also be attitude problems when budgets are set, so not enough time or care to the budget process. Or it might be indifference or poor attitudes when actually trying to implement the budget and reach those targets. And that can occur especially if people don't feel that it's achievable, or that it wasn't a good idea, or that there's no reason for them to get involved. And we'll end up then with control at different stages by different people who might have different attitudes. So a bit of a conflict. So we talked a little bit about getting people involved, and participation can improve motivation, and therefore it can improve the budgets that are actually set. Two types then of attitudes. First of all is top down. Here then participation is almost non-existent. It's also known as imposed budgeting, and it's when senior management basically lay down the law and say, this is what we're going to do, and I'm not particularly interested in what you think. This is what we're going to do, this is my plan, and I want you to go and achieve it. Some organisations then, that kind of approach where employees are told rather than consulted does work. So in new organisations where management experience isn't going to be particularly insightful because we don't know the market, or if it's a very small business, then the senior management can have a handle on all areas. Often in recession or economic hardship, it's going to be appropriate to constrain people and to actually have quite tight budgets. You can also use top-down budgeting if the managers don't actually have the skills to do the budgets themselves. The opposite end of the spectrum then is bottom-up budgeting. And here we're getting people involved, asking the workforce, asking lower level managers who will submit the budgets to their superiors. Different names for this then, bottom-up or participative budgeting. Some people calling it departmental budgeting because all of the departments are preparing their own budgets. Advantages and disadvantages of this one as well then. If you're doing the work on the ground, then you should have accurate knowledge of what's possible, whether or not the machines are capable of producing what the textbook says. You also know the local market, so how realistic it is to increase sales to existing clients, etc. People have much more faith and much more acceptance of a budget that they have set because you want to show that you were right and that it is achievable. You can't sort of say, oh, well, someone else set that, so there's no way I can achieve it. It also frees up top management, so they can be planning the next strategy. They can be thinking about external opportunities rather than day-to-day budgeting. If you've got lots of people within the organisation, though, preparing budgets, thinking about budgets, it becomes time-consuming. Certain managers as well might set budgets which are too easy, so you might end up with something called Budgetary Slack. So if you think you can make 100 units an hour, you might say 90 just to give yourself a bit of a leeway. And that leeway is known as slack. There could also be a lack of consistency between managers. And we can end up with conflicting views, and we could end up with a situation where we go around the houses and never really get anything done. Sometimes then staff who are involved in production are not going to have the skills or the knowledge to prepare an adequate budget. So we've seen advantages then of top-down budgeting and also of bottom-up or participative budgeting. What happens in reality is often some form of negotiation. So managers might be consulted and their feedback taken on board, but senior management set the final budget so that there is consistency and also that top goal of the organisation doesn't get lost. As well as getting them involved up front, another major aspect of motivation is keeping employees informed about how they're doing compared to their targets, especially if there are going to be rewards such as bonuses linked to this. So performance evaluation is important. In chapter 1, we thought about the qualities of good information, and those qualities of good information should also be applied to feedback. So we want to make sure that our feedback is clear and includes everything. It only includes those things that are controllable. So remember, we want to motivate people by getting them involved in setting costs and revenues for areas which they can influence. Don't wait too long and make sure that there aren't mistakes or errors in feedback wherever possible. How this affects the accounting system and performance will depend upon management's overarching attitude, and it's here we're going to look at Hopwood. He identified 3 ways then that this information from the budgets is used to evaluate managerial performance and the impact that that might have. The first one then is the budget constrained manager. The manager then will be measured on their ability to meet the budget. What that means then is that they will make decisions based on the impact on the budget. So if it contributes favourably, the decision will probably be approved. If it doesn't, even if it might lead to leads and sales in the future, then they're not going to do it. So basically, constrained, doing it because it's in the plan, not doing it because it's not in the plan. Quite single-minded and fixated. The profit conscious manager then is trying to increase the effectiveness. So basically, like, do more for less. They want to generate a positive return for shareholders, so they'll be looking at the impact of decisions on the bottom line. Finally, then we've got non-accounting managers and a non-accounting style of evaluation, and the focus here is not financial. So it might be feedback from colleagues, it might be reviews on quality of the products, and we're looking more at non-financial performance measures later on in the course. Budgetary slack, as I've mentioned, is when we've got a deliberate overstatement of costs and understatement of sales, because that just gives you a little bit of leeway in the future. It also means that if you're being evaluated on your performance will look good because you've exceeded the budget, you've met the budget, and not only have you met it, but you've done better than that. And slack and manipulation, if we want to call it that, of the information is more likely if the manager is trying to achieve very intense short-term targets. Example 1 then shows us how this could be tested. So we have to pick which one of the following is an example of budget bias or budgetary slack. So we need to have a look then where we are suspecting some kind of manipulation for the benefit of the manager. In A then, they're using the best estimate of likely costs. So that one isn't going to be, or there's no indication that it is. The advertising budget is disproportionately large in comparison with the revenue generated. Well, might not seem like a great idea strategically, but there might be other reasons for it. It's not necessarily bias. C, a manager is underestimating revenues when setting the budget to assure that the target can be easily exceeded. That is an almost textbook definition of budgetary slack. So the answer is C here. Let's just have a quick look at D to make sure. The manager is consulting with the team to establish an appropriate sales volume. Well, that's definitely not biased. That's participation to try and get the best results. When we're thinking about evaluating performance, something which we've mentioned before is this idea of controllable and uncontrollable costs. And a manager then is only going to be held accountable for a cost over which they have some influence, because that's what makes it a controllable cost. So including in the performance of a manager something like a head office recharge is meaningless because they can't actually influence that head office recharge. Similarly, things like VAT, they're not going to be within their control. If the rate of VAT changes and their purchases increase, that's not the manager's fault, so we wouldn't want to be appraising them on that. The second area that we're going to look at in this chapter of implementation is all about cost control and reduction. So as a definition then, cost control is all about regulating the costs and keeping them down within acceptable limits. And one of the ways that that is undertaken then is by comparing what we thought it was going to cost with what it actually cost. So variance analysis. And we'll see more of that later on. Cost reduction then is the focus here. And this is a planned and positive approach to reducing expenditure. So what we're doing is we're trying to say, well, actually, at the moment, costs are high. Our cost control might be good, so they might be what we expect, but overall, the budgeted allowance for costs might be too high. There are two different approaches to cost reduction. A crash program, sometimes a bit of a knee-jerk reaction, very quickly to try and reduce spending. So problems with cash flow, we've got a big bill that we need to pay, what can we do about this? How can we implement changes in the short term? So what can we cut back on? What don't we need to spend money on? Compared to a longer term program to reduce costs. So continually evaluating, even if we haven't got a cash flow crisis, and seeing whether or not we can make our business leaner and hopefully avoid the need for crash programs. Businesses that are implementing cost reduction programs should look at all of the activities of the company and should think about savings that will have long and short-term benefits. So in the short term, it's easy to go after your variable costs because they are susceptible to cost reduction efforts. But in the long term, you might be able to change some of your fixed costs with a little bit of planning. Some fixed costs then can be avoided if they are discretionary. So things like advertising. But as I said, not just focusing on short term, but realising that in the long term, you can avoid or reduce most of your costs with careful planning. So in the short term at home, you might be able to save money on things like food if you needed to cut back. But in the longer term, you might be able to reduce your accommodation costs by perhaps remortgaging or moving house and paying lower rent. What approaches then can there be to cost reduction? Well, one of them is all to do with efficiency, so how well resources are utilised. So we might think about cutting down on waste of materials, getting more out of the labour, or getting more out of the machinery and other production equipment. One technique which can be used then, which is quite a scientific approach to cost reduction, is known as value analysis. Value analysis reviews all of the materials in the product and all the pieces that are used to make it, but it also thinks about the design of the product. So thinking about modifications that might reduce the cost, but don't actually affect the value of the product to the consumer or the user. So what happens then is that the what the customer is prepared to pay, how much value the product has to them, stays the same, or in some cases might be increased with a reduced cost. So, for example, a lot of car manufacturers will use things like standard petrol caps for all of their models, so that they need less training for the employees, they need to design fewer products, there's less chance of something going wrong, and also they need lower buffer levels of inventory. So it reduces the cost, and the customer probably isn't even aware that the petrol caps are the same on all of the different models, or else wouldn't care. Value engineering then is a technique that's very similar to value analysis, but it's specific to new products. So what we're doing here then is, at the design and the development stage, coming up with the best possible product at the lowest cost. And there are 4 different aspects of this value. Cost value, so how much does it cost to produce and sell the item? Exchange value, so what's it worth on the market? What are people prepared to exchange? What are they prepared to pay for it? What's its use value? So what does it do? And what about its prestige, the esteem value? How much benefit is there in owning it? So branding will often feature as part of that. In this chapter then, we've been thinking about some of the wordy aspects of implementing budgets. And we started off with behavioural aspects. So some terminology there that's very important. So motivation, getting people on board through goal congruence, so getting everyone in the organisation to work to the same goals as the company as a whole. Talked about some of the issues with behaviour that can occur, and the main one is probably budgetary slack, so this deliberate overstatement of the results. There then is the question about whether or not to get employees involved in the budget setting process. So whether or not participation through bottom-up budgets is a good idea, or whether it's more efficient for employees to just tell and use top-down budgets. And in reality, negotiated budgets are most common, but you need to be aware of the advantages and disadvantages of the other two. It's important then that we tell people how their results are progressing through performance evaluation, and Hopwood gave us the 3 different ways then of evaluating managerial performance. So there was that of the budget constrained, the profit conscious, and finally the non-accounting manager, who looks at non-financial features. We looked as well at reducing and controlling costs. So cost control then very much linked to the variances we'll see later on, whereas cost reduction is not just trying to come in line with the budget like cost control, but actually reduce spending overall. And there are different approaches then to cost reduction. So crash programs, where we very quickly need to cut spending levels because of an impending crisis, and a planned program where we want to reduce our cost base over time. The whole company then should be considered, and we need to consider objectives for both the long and the short term. Different ways then to reduce costs can come through efficiency, and that could be to do with materials, labour or machinery. With value analysis then, we're looking at the planned scientific approach to cost reduction. So that could be the cost value, the cost of producing the item, the exchange value, so what you'd pay for it, the use value, what you do with it, and the esteem value, the prestige. But overall, what we're trying to do is to keep the value the same or improve it, whilst at the same time reducing the costs of delivering it to the customer.